I've been thinking about the future.
The future.
The future.
The future.
It's the future.
Future. The future.
I've been thinking about how crazy the world feels right now, how chaotic the political climate is, how our evil AI overlords will take over the world soon. But anytime I worry about the future, I rely on my books, my science fiction books more specifically. And I keep returning to two of my favorite series that look forward into the future better than any others, Foundation and Dune. Now, if you've watched any of my videos on this channel before, you probably know that I'm a big fan of Dune. But when I was younger, I first read the Foundation series. Foundation is a story of a brilliant mathematician who predicts the fall of the Galactic Empire and uses his calculations to pave a safe path forward for human civilization. Dune is the story of a homeschooled kid who takes space drugs for the first time and accidentally unleashes a holy war upon the universe. These two stories couldn't sound more different. However, as I grew older, returning to these books time and time again, I realized they were oddly connected. Each series proposes the best way forward into the future, but those paths are at odds with each other. Even the villain of one book is the hero of the other. Dune is actually the opposite of Foundation.
Wait, what are you talking about?
Now, I'm not the first person to notice this either. These books came out decades ago. Writers and critics like Tim O'Reilly and John L. Grigsby have extensively analyzed this strange rivalry between these two staples of the science fiction world. But I too am fascinated with the relationship between these books and their authors, Isaac Asimov and Frank Herbert. I'm so fascinated, in fact,
I even went to the library.
Because who was right, Asimov or Herbert? The more I learned, the more I began doubting my faith in each of their messages. How could I reconcile these two conflicting ideas of my favorite books? But that's what I'm going to try and answer today. Which of these books has the better vision of the future? Foundation or Dune? Now, fair warning, I will be discussing major plot points for both series, so if you don't want to be spoiled, pause this video and go read these 13 books, and I'll be here when you get back. Oh, already done? That was fast. Okay, let's go into the future. But first, the past. The golden age of science fiction took place in the late 1930s to the mid-1940s, and saw an abundance of science fiction magazines and a new generation of writers who would create stories that still resonate with readers today. And when writer John W. Campbell became editor of Astounding Stories in 1937 and changed the name of the magazine to Astounding Science Fiction, he began curating the work of writers like Robert Heinlein, Clifford Simak, and Isaac Asimov.
Hello.
Asimov began writing stories as a young boy and was already a published writer as a teenager. He and many other writers of the Golden Age grew up reading science fiction and wanted to push the boundaries of the genre beyond the gimmicks of the pulp stories of previous decades. And they embraced a newfound optimism for a brighter future and an improved society, brought about by the promise of new technology, like robots. Asimov belonged to a science fiction club of writers known as the Futurians. Many members of this club, including editor and writer Donald A. Wollheim, were fascinated with the political applications of the utopian worlds that their science fiction stories could provide. These political ideas ranged from Marxism and communism to technocratic leadership. Wollheim believed science fiction followers should actively work for the realization of the scientific socialist world state as the only genuine justification for their activities and existence. But along with the tumultuous political movements of the time, World War II introduced the world to the nuclear age. And so John Campbell recognized that science fiction stories published in the near future will be laid in the far future, long after the troubles of the mid-20th century. So finally, in the May 1942 edition of Astounding Science Fiction, Campbell published the first of Asimov's Foundation short stories. These stories looked far into the future, but still featured trends and concerns of the time in which they were written. Utopian societies brought about by new technology, nuclear Cold War, and government leadership in the form of technocracy. Asimov was also fascinated with the fall of the Roman Empire, further proof that men have always been thinking about the fall of the Roman Empire since, well, probably the fall of the Roman Empire? So Foundation became the first of its kind, establishing an empire the size of an entire galaxy. Without Foundation, we obviously wouldn't have similar galactic empires like that in Dune, Warhammer 40K, and yeah, even Star Wars.
The first galactic empire!
Enough of that. But by the beginning of Foundation's story, its galactic empire has reached such an unwieldy size that it has become a stagnant, cumbersome bureaucracy, inevitably doomed to fail. And that's exactly what Harry Seldon and his theory of psychohistory predicts.
You're stretched too thin.
Selden, a brilliant professor of mathematics, developed psychohistory as a study of human behavior throughout history on such a macro scale that it could statistically predict the movement of the human species into the future. The history part of psychohistory took Asimov's ponderings of ancient Rome, and the psycho blended in one of the more popular psychological theories at the time, behavioral psychology. Psychologists like B.F. Skinner purported that learning and behavior could be controlled by one's environment. Ooh, snacks. Skinner even wrote Walden 2, which featured a utopia formed by behaviorist techniques. This society valued the behavior of the community as a whole over individualism and free will. As for psychohistory, Harry Selden admits he cannot use his theory to calculate the actions of individuals.
I don't know what you're going to have for dinner, if that's what you're asking.
But at least he can foresee that a civilization the size of the Galactic Empire will collapse, and society will fall into 30,000 years of a barbaric dark age. With his knowledge of human behavior throughout history, Selden proposes a plan to shorten those dark ages to a mere 1,000 years before rebuilding a new empire.
I'm trying to soften the fall.
By forming a foundation of psychohistorians, he can lead humankind along his calculated path towards creating an improved society. Once the empire begins its collapse, the Foundation is confronted by multiple crises, moments when they fear humanity may diverge from the safe path Selden had calculated. The Foundation discovers, though, that each time its mission is threatened, psychohistory has already correctly predicted the outcome of each crisis, and the Foundation slowly secures more and more control over the remnants of the old empire. First, when surrounding kingdoms threatened to attack the Foundation, Selden predicted the Foundation would maintain a balance of power as it remains the only group that controls nuclear technology. Next, when a kingdom threatens to seize the Foundation's atomic power, Selden knew that by this time the Foundation would have wielded its knowledge of technology as a magic religion, framing any revolt against the Foundation as a sin. Then, after the mystery of religion wears away and more kingdoms oppose the Foundation, Selden foresaw that traders and merchants would hold economic power by placing adversaries under trade embargoes, limiting access to the Foundation's highly coveted nuclear technology. And even when the remnants of the old empire tried to reclaim the Foundation's expanding borders, Selden knew that the Galactic Empire's resources would be unable to sustain any prolonged warfare. Multiple times throughout these stories, members of the Foundation question their blind faith in Harry Selden.
He didn't just not tell us. He lied to us.
They even refer to his plan as Selden's dead hand, and debate whether or not any of them needs to take individual action to enact it.
I started to believe that I actually was special.
Because if psychohistory truly calculates and predicts the flow of the masses, then what effect, when weighed against the movement of humankind as a whole, could one person's actions have on the future? As each Selden crisis resolves just as Selden expected it, the Foundation accepts that the Selden plan just works and the future is secure. That is, until the mule arrives. The mule is an anomaly, unpredicted and outside of Harry Selden's calculations. Different from other humans, he is a mentalic, a mutant who can telepathically manipulate the minds of others, turning them into devoted followers. With his powers, he quickly defeats the Foundation, entirely upsetting the Selden plan as he builds his own galactic empire. And it's at this point in the Foundation series that Selden's psychohistory and Asimov's ideal future are truly tested. What happens when a single individual challenges the organized order of the universe? Surely the altruistic mission of Harry Selden and the Foundation had been a good plan, right? If this optimistic outlook could so easily be shattered, could any science fiction provide a better solution than Asimov's Clockwork future? By the 1960s and 70s, the modernist literary movement had seeped into the world of science fiction. As writers began testing the limits of earlier science fiction, experimenting with style and structure, many were turning their focus from outer space to inner space.
I'm not a man.
Wrong inner space.
No!
Writers were no longer exploring what idealistic futures science and technology could create for us, but instead explored the possibilities of psychological and social sciences. Influenced by the trends of the time, like drug culture, sexual liberation, and environmentalism, this new wave of science fiction looked to critique the older science fiction concepts of the Golden Age. And a certain Isaac Asimov I could name did not like this.
There is also an influx of a new kind of writer now, a writer who is not primarily interested in science.
In the August 1967 issue of Galaxy magazine, Asimov wrote in a guest editorial piece, "I'm not sure I can tell you exactly what the new wave is, but I have noticed something that is becoming more and more prevalent in the science fiction of the 60s. Science fiction tends to be lacking in science these days." A year later, in Worlds of If magazine, Asimov continued in a letter to the editor, "There is a growing tendency to delete the science from science fiction. There are science fiction writers who think that science is a bad thing, and that science fiction is a wonderful field in which to make this plain." But many writers of this new wave viewed this rejection of science as a healthy skepticism. The end of World War II and the beginnings of the Cold War had displayed the terror of the nuclear age, and the optimism towards a bright future brought about by advanced technology had pretty much diminished. Writers questioned if the existing technology and ideals of the Western Hemisphere truly provided the best solutions for humankind's future. And it is with this analysis of the faith that we put into the established science and knowledge of our times where Frank Herbert enters the picture. Herbert began writing at an early age and earned a living as a newspaper reporter, eager to gain as much first-hand experience with his topics as possible.
I wanted to know, I wanted to dig.
Attempting to break out as a published writer, Herbert first tried his hand at westerns and war stories. Eventually, though, he came to realize that this new wave of science fiction was the perfect outlet with which he could collect all of his diverse ideas and influences. Herbert studied psychology, as well as the theories of general semantics. He came to question how language could condition and program people's minds and behaviors, just based on preconceived notions people associate with words. And throughout the sweeping political movements of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, he also recognized the dangers of charismatic leaders, who could sway entire nations and peoples with promises of a better future.
I kid around and I say that my favorite president in recent years has been Richard Nixon, because he taught us to distrust government.
And so, while researching for an article about the beaches of the Oregon coast, Herbert finally found his concept for a science fiction story that could encompass his many disparate ideas. He became fascinated with the ecological process of preserving sand dunes and the long-term planning needed for humans to have any effect on their environment. He imagined an entire desert planet. He recognized how the deserts on Earth were wellsprings of religions, and how one could even use ecology as a religion. A leader could unite an entire people to slowly change their desert planet into something different over a course of time far longer than the lives of the individuals involved. He initially wrote a story similar to that of the adventures of T.E. Lawrence. But rather than surrender to the tropes of a white savior who becomes a hero to their newfound people, the story of Dune could accomplish more. Herbert could question how messianic leaders can prophesize a better future and the problems that can arise from the absolutes we build our futures on. So with all of that in mind, let's take a look at the plot of Dune. About 20 years after Foundation was first published, astounding science fiction, now titled Analog Magazine, introduced the world to Dune. And when we look at the universe of Dune, it's easy to see how Frank Herbert established a similar galactic scale setting to Foundation, primed for a character like the Mule to upset an entire empire. In the very beginning of Dune's lore, Herbert immediately rejects the concept of a bright future brought about by advanced technology. 10,000 years before the story of Dune, humans had become complacent and stagnant as it relied on machines to think for them and to automate every facet of life. The Butlerian Jihad became an uprising against AI, automation, and those who would use machines to control others. Humanity would rebuild and create an imperium that would last for the next 10,000 years. And by the time of Dune's story, this empire has become a stagnant, feudalistic society with various factions maintaining tight control over technology, religion, commerce, and travel. Instead of the Foundation limiting access to technological advancement, citizens of the Dune Imperium follow an ecumenical decree that thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind, a remnant belief from the Butlerian Jihad. Instead of the independent traders and merchants of the Foundation, the organization Combine Honnête Ober Advancer Mercantiles, or CHOAM, holds a monopoly on all commerce throughout the Imperium. This is all delicately balanced by the Spacing Guild, which holds a monopoly on interstellar travel and requires a hefty payment of spice to transport any people or resources. However, the organization that truly controls the Imperium is the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood. This society of women took on subordinate roles as advisors, servants, consorts, and concubines among the royal houses, even to the emperor himself. And just like the priests and wizards of the Foundation, the Bene Gesserit control the politics of the Imperium and the beliefs of entire populations by spreading the myths and superstitions of religions.
You see what they've been told to see?
And after the devastation of the Butlerian Jihad thousands of years earlier, the Bene Gesserit have had their own long-term plan to avoid such barbarism in the future. Through a selective breeding program, they aim to create the Kwisatz Haderach, a human being with the ability to see all of time and space. And just as the Foundation relies on the predeterminism of psychohistory, the Sisterhood plans to use their profit to reveal the future and lead humanity along the safest path for survival. But the long-awaited Kwisatz Haderach, Paul Atreides, is born one generation earlier than expected. His superhuman abilities and prescient sight allow him to see farther than the Bene Gesserit could have ever imagined, and he upsets their centuries-long plans for the future.
The Kwisatz Haderach is a form of power that our world has not yet seen.
And it is here where we encounter a nexus of Herbert's and Asimov's narratives. Dune is Frank Herbert's twist on Foundation, in which instead of framing the mule as the villain, he is actually the hero, Paul Atreides. Paul is just as much of a catalyst as the mule. On the path towards the future, he walks without rhythm, taking incalculable and unpredictable risks.
Why does he take such risks?
He is an unanticipated anomaly that unravels years of planning, unleashing a war that breaks the control of the previous empire. And unlike the valiant depiction of the psychohistorians in Foundation, paving the best path forward for humanity's future, the Bene Gesserit are antagonists throughout the entire Dune series, as they try to harness their rogue messiah for their own schemes. As the stories of both Foundation and Dune move forward, the Mule and Paul serve as diverging points to prove each respective author's true vision of an ideal future. Writers and storytellers usually include parts of themselves in their work, so it should come as no surprise that Harry Seldon was Isaac Asimov's literary alter ego.
Now let's look ahead to the future from this point on. First as seen by the man some call the #1 futurist around.
Most people, when they think about the future, try to reach out to the year 2000. Let's try 500 years from now. What kind of planet do you see?
But instead of seeing the downfall of our society, Asimov remained optimistic of what humanity could accomplish with science and technology. And he fiercely believed in the power of the futures that science fiction could provide. In his 1953 essay, Social Science Fiction, Asimov outlines how the genre creates speculative futures, either by imagining strange worlds and scenarios, or by forming plausible futures based on our recognizable society.
I think science fiction refers to different societies which are connected to ours through scientific and technological change.
He compares his form of science fiction writing to a chess game. If a story begins with a human society, like the one that we have today, those recognized chess pieces begin in their assigned positions. Then, by just following the rules of the game, one can extrapolate the patterns of how a future story will play out. Asimov continues saying that this chess analogy can apply to any society throughout human history. He then shows similar passages in history that roughly follow the same course. He doesn't claim history repeats itself, but he explains it is legitimate to extrapolate from the past because sometimes such extrapolations are fairly close to what happens. Asimov still has to caveat this outlook with sometimes and fairly close. His chess game analogy only works when he admits he must look at history in the broadest of strokes and ignore the details of specific individuals. So when he applies this chess game to the future, his predictions also remain general and broad. But Asimov also understood that science fiction doesn't exist to predict the exact future.
It's very difficult, really, to visualize the real future.
Science fiction writers of the present can create infinite possible futures for readers to experience.
We can't just predict. There isn't enough story material and straight prediction. We make up futures. It doesn't matter whether we really think they'll come to pass or not. But we ask ourselves only, will this be interesting to deal with? Will this make a nice story? And then if some of them do come true, well, good.
He concludes his essay with, the contribution science fiction can make to society is that of accustoming its readers to the thought of the inevitability of continuing change, and the necessity of directing and shaping that change rather than opposing it blindly or blindly permitting it to overwhelm us. But Asimov's predictions remained within a grid of a chessboard, with only a general outcome. And in a story like Foundation, the psychohistorians cannot depend upon a general future. The mule doesn't play by the same rules of chess. So how can the first Foundation protect itself and move forward? New rules and guidelines must be made. As the Mule continues his conquest of the galaxy, he pushes the Selden plan for the Foundation further off its projected course. And in a story where the solution is to control the amount of variables in the environment, Selden's plan, and therefore Asimov's plan, to course correct everything becomes fairly obvious.
You know damn well, my numbers were predicated on the creation of a second foundation, remember?
Yes, a second foundation, a higher order that can secretly pull the right strings and align the perfect circumstances for the first foundation to succeed. Selden had established a second hidden foundation that altered and updated the mathematics of psychohistory as time went on. And instead of a mastery over the physical sciences like the first foundation, the second foundation had mastery over the mental sciences. But just like the Mule, the second foundation could change the thoughts and minds of others, or in the framework of B.F. Skinner's theories, they could directly manipulate behavior by external stimuli. But instead of using their powers for evil, the second foundation manipulates others only enough to keep the Selden plan on track. Only when we see the second foundation directly face the Mule in a psychic battle do we get to see the full power of the second foundation. The Mule is merely tricked into giving up his war and just go home. As members of the first foundation come to suspect that the second foundation is also manipulating their actions, which of course is what is actually happening, the second foundation erases all evidence of its existence from their minds and continues maintaining the Selden plan. The first foundation just continues on its original mission to pave the way forward for humanity's future. In the end, the future is predictable and calculable. Nothing is too unexpected that science cannot overcome. But it's this type of surprise-free future that Frank Herbert believed was dangerous.
The whole idea of the future struck me as rather interesting because if it's the future, it's already there and we're just approaching it. Nothing's going to change. It'll just unfold suddenly and there it'll be. What I'm addressing is this whole idea of absolutes and your helplessness in the face of such overwhelming movements in mankind. Now, we get overwhelmed occasionally, but I think each of us has a future. And lots of times, individuals can have a tremendous influence on the futures of all of us.
In 1977, shortly after the Dune trilogy had been completed, Herbert wrote an essay titled Men on Other Planets. Here, he analyzes the assumptions that science fiction writers used when exploring distant futures and alien worlds. He questions the absolutes that we as humans apply to the unknown. He sees the absolute science that shaped earlier works of science fiction as preconceptions that should be challenged. And Herbert specifically breaks down Asimov's Foundation trilogy, where he outlines 3 major assumptions of the future based on the science and knowledge from the time when Asimov wrote Foundation. He explains the clear connection between behaviorist psychology and psychohistory. He highlights Asimov's belief that individual behavior and disorder can be controlled by a higher logical power. And he also demonstrates that the Society of Foundation is no different than the society of the 1940s and 50s. The world 50,000 years into the future is the same chess game as the 20th century. Herbert still rightfully acknowledges Asimov's achievement in the world of science fiction, and the massive influence Foundation had had on other writers. But Herbert viewed the technocratic concepts of Foundation, allowing only an elite few to manage and control the outcomes of an entire population, as no better than an aristocracy leading humanity along a false path into the future. He specifically references President Roosevelt's brain trust, tasked in the 1930s to predict what the world would be like in the 1950s. Yet, Herbert notes, the brain trust could not have anticipated innovations like transistors, atomic power, jet engines, or antibiotics. Herbert also points to Herman Kahn's conservative think tank, the Hudson Institute. In 1967, it released its projections for the year 2000. And this book includes all manner of statistics on expected GDP and policy changes, to even assuming that every household will have moderately priced robots doing most of the housework. The Hudson Institute even extended its projections to the year 2020. And just like Conan O'Brien's in the year 2000, it wasn't exactly correct.
The Chicago Cubs and Boston Red Sox will meet in the World Series.
So how can we in the present day truly expect to plan for the future? Herbert wanted science fiction to break away from futures that followed the same patterns of humanity's history. But in order to break the cycles predicated on the past, in Dune, Herbert had to push Paul's power of prophecy to its limits to continue challenging Asimov's assumptions of a manageable future. Paul successfully seizes power and establishes a new empire unlike the Mule. Legions of his fanatical warriors tear across the universe, ending millennia of stagnation under the Old Imperium. And where the Mule's rebellion is thwarted by a higher power of control, Paul instead defies the efforts of the Bene Gesserit as he leads humanity along his own path into the future. And side note, I personally think that a minor character in Dune, Count Fenring, is Herbert's nod to the Mule. Both Count Fenring and the Mule are sterile, and speak with false speech impediments to fool their adversaries. Count Fenring had the potential to be a Kwisatz Haderach like Paul, but was unwilling to take uncalculable risks. In the final chapter of Dune, Fenring recognizes Paul's superiority as a true Kwisatz Haderach, so I'm pretty sure Herbert was teasing that Paul was better than his version of Asimov's Mule. But as the Dune saga continues, Paul falls into the trap of trying to control the chaos of the infinite future timelines in his visions. With Paul as both the political and religious head of his new empire, his followers look to him to reveal what the future holds. But by promising a singular vision of the future, Paul threatens to drag all of humankind along a lockstep and dangerous path.
But I do see a way. There is a narrow way through.
The opening chapter of Dune Messiah tells us readers, only through the lethal nature of prophecy can we understand the failures of such enormous and far-seeing power. In his book on Frank Herbert, Tim O'Reilly delves even further. The fundamentally chaotic nature of time runs contrary to man's hunger for order. Prophecy is a trap because it seems to offer power over the chaos of time. Paul can see multiple futures, all easily malleable and swept away by the sands of time. The moment Paul tries to impose any order on a specific future, he must choose the correct actions to create that order, so much so that he eventually locks himself into the singular path he created. He no longer walks without rhythm. To Herbert, this is a form of ultimate death. In a letter to his editor, John W. Campbell, remember that guy? Herbert explains the dangers of imposing order over time itself. But let's look at the logical projection of a completely orderly time and a universe of absolute logic. Aren't we saying here that it's possible to know everything? Then doesn't this mean that the system of knowing will one day enclose itself? And isn't that a sort of prison? By the end of Dune Messiah, Paul confronts the doom he committed himself to, and finally embraces the uncertainty of the future. He shuts his prescient sight away and walks into the desert.
My road leads into the desert. I can see it.
Dune Messiah is a real downer, but it's my favorite. And fair warning, once you've read it, you'll never watch Revenge of the Sith the same way ever again.
Babies.
But the empire Paul leaves behind in Dune Messiah still yearns for certainty of the future. Humanity remains dependent on a Messiah to reveal a singular future amidst the chaos of possibilities. And the political instability left in Paul's absence threatens to throw humanity back into a chaotic time of war. Herbert did believe in a predetermined cycle that humanity constantly returns to, periods of peace and repression, which then leads to periods of war and resistance. He even writes in his essay, Listening to the Left Hand, one of the themes of my own science fiction novel, Dune, is war as a collective orgasm. His words, not mine. The Butlerian Jihad was a fervorous revolt against the loss of autonomy to thinking machines. Paul's uprising destroyed the stagnation of a 10,000-year-old empire, and Paul's new empire was only attainable through oppression, and his promise of a peaceful paradise only fomented rebellion.
Lead them to paradise.
It seems that a peaceful future will never be attainable because humanity will always return to violence. But in Children of Dune, the third book of the Dune series, Herbert attempts to break humanity free from a future based on the cycles of humanity's past. Paul's son, Leto II, must choose to either continue the same cycle as his father or destroy it altogether. Leto II eventually decides to teach humanity an ultimate lesson and push Paul's example to the extreme. And here, Herbert truly reveals the terror of charismatic leaders with their promises of a perfect future. By combining his body with sandworm DNA, I know, just stick with me here, Leto II becomes a monster that will live for thousands of years. Over this time span, as both a messiah and a tyrant, he promises to give his empire the ultimate peace and prosperity it claimed it always wanted. But with this peace comes the oppression to maintain it and the stagnation of the entire human race. He will lead humanity along his golden path to a singular, surprise-free future. Now, as with any good trilogy, there is always an insatiable demand for more sequels.
More!
In John L. Grigsby's essay, Herbert's Reversal of Asimov's Vision Reassessed, in which he explores the 4th entries of the Foundation and Dune series, we see how each author pushes their ideal future even further in their sequels. In 1981, Frank Herbert wrote God Emperor of Dune, which finally asks, would you love me if I was a worm? And in 1982, more than 30 years after the Foundation trilogy, Asimov finally wrote its sequel, Foundation's Edge. Great title for a book that's about the Foundation lasting longer. Foundation's Edge brings the focus back to the first Foundation, which suspects a higher force like the second Foundation still manipulates their actions, which it is. A first Foundationer, Golan Trevise, fears that once the psychohistorians create a new empire, the second Foundation will assume control and take all of the credit. Trevise aims to prevent that same type of technocratic aristocracy that concerned Frank Herbert in the original Foundation trilogy. But where Asimov flipped his own narrative, making the second Foundation the antagonists, Herbert's tyrannical villain is aware that he is the antagonist. Leto II's Golden Path aims to teach the human race that a single visionary or controlling government that imposes order over others is not the answer to humanity's salvation.
I think that our society was formed on a distrust for government, and we seem to have lost that distrust of government.
In God Emperor of Dune, Leto II, now 3,500 years old and more worm than human, continues oppressing his empire into a forced peace. He has successfully created the structured, predetermined, surprise-free future that the Second Foundation aims to achieve. And yet, at the same time, Leto II has had his own breeding experiment, aiming to stoke rebellion against his own empire. He eventually creates a descendant, Siona Atreides, who is invisible to prescience because she so strongly embodies individualism and free will. But in Foundation's Edge, Asimov still embraces a deterministic view on how to manage humanity's future. Amidst the conflict between the First Foundation and the Second Foundation, Asimov proposes a new alternative to psychohistory. Trevise discovers a utopian world known as Gaia, a planet-sized group consciousness in which all of the citizens live in harmony and balance with their environment. The inhabitants of Gaia, however, admit that this perfect world was only attainable with the help of robots, who have long since disappeared. Trevise must then choose which form of society would be best for humanity's future, the First Foundation, the Second Foundation, or Gaia. He eventually chooses Gaia, but admits there may still be a higher power of control which has affected his decision. In Grigsby's essay, he explains that Gaia is nothing more than an updated version of B.F. Skinner's Walden 2 again, where Gaia exists and functions perfectly, but at the cost of individualism and free will. And with the introduction of robots into the Foundation mythos, Asimov yet again returns to his ultimate faith in science and technology.
Robots.
Foundation's Edge ends with humanity's future controlled either by behaviorist ideals or the predetermined calculations of machines. God Emperor of Dune ends with the final stage of the Golden Path coming into fruition. Leto II's death triggers a sudden scattering of humans across the universe, fleeing the bonds of their old empire, diversifying the human species more than ever before. Having experienced the true pain of a peaceful paradise, humans should no longer return to the cycle of stagnation and war. Siona Atreides and the rest of her descendants continue shaping their futures in unpredictable ways, independent of any form of determinism.
To make a world where humankind can create its own future from moment to moment, free of one man's vision.
But where is the logical end? In 1986, Asimov published another Foundation novel, Foundation and Earth. After the great popularity of his other major sagas, the Robot series and the Empire series, Asimov decided to unify them together into the same continuity as Foundation. Foundation's Edge ended with the decision for humankind to evolve into a group consciousness, like the planet Gaia. But by Foundation and Earth, the characters remain suspicious that yet another higher power may have influenced their choice. After teasing the concept of robotic involvement in Foundation's Edge, the end of Foundation and Earth reveals that for the entirety of the Foundation series, the mysterious power guiding the First Foundation, the Second Foundation, and even Gaia was in fact a robot.
Robots.
The robot, R. Daniil Oliva, a recurring character originally introduced in Asimov's The Caves of Steel, came to the conclusion that it was responsible for protecting the entire human species. Unable to calculate the needs of each individual human, Oliva realized it would be easier to understand humans as a single entity, or in Asimov's analogy, like chess pieces on a board following the rules of the game. And so Oliva slowly guided and manipulated the human race for thousands of years down a predetermined path. Asimov even wrote 2 prequels to the Foundation series, Prelude to Foundation and Forward to Foundation, in which Oliva, disguised as a human, guides Harry Seldon in the creation of psychohistory. Oliva also revealed that in order for it to form Gaia, it had to create humans who valued life as a whole over their individual needs, basically creating an entire race of robots. And by the conclusion of Foundation and Earth, a dying Oliva asks if humans would like to evolve into Galaxia, a galactic-sized group consciousness. Golan Trevise is free to decide if this is the best future for humanity. But after Oliva had guided his decision to choose a planet-sized group consciousness, like Gaia, Trevise easily agrees to expand human evolution to become Galaxia as well. And with the human species finally behaving as a single entity, Oliva rests easy, believing that all of humankind is safe. But safe from what though? Themselves? More mentalics like the mule? Asimov hints at the potential of an outside alien threat, but he also admitted that he wasn't quite sure how to continue his story after this point. His conclusion to his 3 epic sagas still posits a utopian society the scale of which B.F. Skinner could only dream of. Asimov's answer for humanity's future ultimately lay in the faith of science and technology while foregoing individualism and free will. And sadly, Frank Herbert passed away in 1986 without finishing a planned 7th book to conclude the Dune saga. But he had continued in his direction of exploring an unknown universe with the 5th and 6th books, Heretics of Dune and Chapter House Dune. 15 centuries after the death of Leto II, the Bene Gesserit eventually breed Atreides descendants that they can control. New adversaries flee from unknown parts of the universe, bringing with them the next cycle of war for humanity. And many humans have returned to a reliance on machines and advanced technology again. And yet, the Atreides continue surprising the Bene Gesserit, taking incalculable risks and doing the unexpected. Eventually, the 6th book, Chapter House Dune, ends on a major cliffhanger, with many of the characters escaping in an invisible ship to an unknown universe. And for the original 6 Dune books, this feels like a bittersweet and fitting end. Herbert wanted humanity to escape a predetermined future, to embrace the unknown, to challenge ourselves with infinity. Readers of the Dune saga are left to decide for themselves what they think Dune's future can hold. But where does this all leave us? Where does this leave me? Asimov continued his faith in an ordered, logical universe while Herbert embraced the challenges of the unknown. Each story overextends itself into the unbelievable with robots and human sandworm hybrids that live for thousands of years. Each author leaves us with unanswered questions about the fate of their characters and where each story truly ends, but at least their core messages still remain relevant to today. We should learn from our past, but not be entirely dependent on the past for answers. We should be open to the possibilities of the future, but not be entirely blind to them. We can't predict the future, but we can prepare ourselves for it and improvise at the same time. It's up to us as individuals to shape our own futures, and that is the only way we will each continue to grow and evolve. And if that answer sounds easy and obvious, then at least these books help remind me to be conscious of that whenever I think about what the future holds. Now, if you liked this video and this topic, I highly suggest reading Tim O'Reilly's and John L. Grigsby's analyses, and I'll make sure to leave a link to their writings in the description below. But tell us, what do you think? Would you prefer a future that follows a safe, predetermined path? Or would you embrace an unpredictable future full of unknown chaos? What other future outcomes could we possibly experience? Let us know in the comments below, and thanks for watching. And remember, for all of the best foresight into all things pop culture, stay tuned to Nerdist.com.